There is a subtle, yet powerful teaching in the recognition of what we allow into our lives. What we tolerate shapes the landscape of our existence. When we consent, whether consciously or unconsciously, to certain behaviors around us, we invite their energy to take root. It is a profound act of surrender to either chaos or harmony. Long ago, a mind deeply attuned to the nature of human dynamics offered a caution and urging to not tolerate certain behaviors. Behaviors that, when left unchecked, disturb the balance within ourselves and the communities we hold dear. Today, I invite you to reflect with me on 7 such behaviors, 7 ripples of disturbance that deserve our clear and unwavering boundary. Deceit is a subtle disturbance that seeps quietly into the spaces between people. It is the act of veiling the truth, not with loud fanfare, but with a soft, insidious whisper that shifts reality just enough to create confusion and doubt. When deceit enters a relationship, whether between friends, family, colleagues, or even within ourselves, it fractures the invisible thread of trust that binds us. Trust is not merely a social contract. It is the fertile soil from which connection, safety, and peace grow. Without it, relationships wither, becoming barren landscapes of suspicion and uncertainty. To tolerate deceit is to consent to a shadow that dims the clarity of our perception. It is to invite a persistent fog that clouds judgment and breeds fear. This is not always obvious in the beginning. Deceit often hides behind half-truths or carefully crafted stories designed to maintain appearances while eroding authenticity. In allowing this behavior to persist, we open a door to a silent erosion of our own sense of reality. Over time, what was once a minor bending of truth can spiral into a labyrinth of lies that entangles not only those who deceive, but also those who permit the deception. The energy of deceit is draining. It disrupts the flow of genuine communication, replacing openness with guardedness and spontaneity with calculation. When we suspect or know that truth is being masked, the heart contracts. Fear takes root, fear of being messled, of being vulnerable in the presence of a falsehood. This fear is not born out of the external world, but arises from an inner recognition that the ground beneath us is no longer stable. Our connection to others, and even to ourselves, becomes shaky. We begin to question what is real and what is fabricated, which leaves us exhausted and disconnected. More deeply, deceit is a refusal to engage with life as it is. It is a resistance to presence, to the raw and sometimes uncomfortable reality that life offers. Instead of facing what is, deceit attempts to rewrite the narrative to fit desires or fears. Yet this act of avoidance never brings lasting peace. The tension between truth and falsehood lingers invisibly, like a tension in the air before a storm. To not tolerate deceit is to hold space for clarity and integrity. It is a gentle yet firm boundary that protects the essence of trust within ourselves and in our relationships. When we refuse to accept deceit, we affirm the power of truth, not as a weapon, but as a light that dissolves confusion and reveals the way forward. The presence of truth invites openness, vulnerability, and ultimately freedom. Betrayal is a wound that cuts deeper than the physical, reaching into the very core of our being. It is the breaking of sacred bonds, those invisible threads of loyalty and commitment that connect us to others in trust and mutual respect. When betrayal occurs, it is not merely a failure of promise or expectation. It is a profound fracture in the fabric of relationship that echoes far beyond the moment of the act. The pain that follows betrayal is unlike any ordinary disappointment. It strikes at the heart's sense of safety and belonging, shaking the foundations upon which our sense of self and connection rest. To tolerate betrayal is to open a fissure in the collective field of integrity that surrounds us. It is to allow division and alienation to take root where unity once flourished. Betrayal transforms familiar faces into strangers and close connections into distant memories. The aftermath of betrayal is often marked by confusion and disbelief. How could the one we trusted most become the source of such hurt? This question lingers because betrayal is not simply a mistake. It is an intentional turning away from the shared values and understandings that hold relationships together. The energy of betrayal spreads like a shadow through the spaces where light once shone freely. It breeds resentment, anger, and sorrow, which can cloud the mind and weigh heavily on the spirit. The betrayed may find themselves caught in a cycle of replaying the event, searching for answers, and grappling with the overwhelming sense of loss. In this process, the natural flow of life is disrupted, and the possibility of peace feels distant. At a deeper level, betrayal reveals the fragile nature of human trust and the vulnerability that comes with opening oneself to another. It is a reminder that trust is not a guarantee, but a gift, one that must be guarded and honored. To tolerate betrayal is to diminish the sacredness of this gift, allowing the seed of doubt to grow within the heart. This doubt can extend beyond the individual, affecting how we relate to others and even how we perceive ourselves. Yet betrayal also calls us to a higher awareness. It invites us to see clearly where boundaries must be drawn, where protection of the self and the community is necessary. It teaches the importance of honoring one's own dignity by refusing to accept harm that fractures our inner harmony. In this refusal, there is not only strength but also the possibility of healing, a way back toward wholeness and renewed connection. Founded on truth and respect, arrogance is a distortion of presence. It is the illusion that one is inherently above others, that their perspective holds greater value, that their being carries more importance. This state arises not from true confidence or inner peace, but from an over-identification with form, status, intelligence, appearance, achievement. In arrogance, the ego inflates itself through comparison, feeding off imagined hierarchies and separateness. It does not see others as equals, but as tools, threats, or lesser beings. This posture disconnects the individual from the deeper truth that beneath all surface identities, we are the same living presence, arising from the same stillness. When arrogance enters a space, it alters the flow of energy. It closes the heart. The arrogant person cannot truly listen. They do not hear others with openness, but with a mind already full of judgment, ready to assert its dominance or dismiss what does not serve its image. Arrogance thrives in environments where power is mistaken for wisdom, where silence is interpreted as weakness, and where humility is misunderstood as lack. But in reality, arrogance is deeply insecure. It is a fragile construction that requires constant reinforcement. It fears exposure, vulnerability, and the surrender of control. To tolerate arrogance is to allow the subtle violence of superiority to influence our field. Even when unspoken, arrogance sends a clear message, I am more. This message does not just affect those who receive it, it also harms the one who carries it. For in believing they are more, they have already cut themselves off from the shared human experience. They can no longer learn because they believe they already know. They can no longer connect because they stand above rather than beside. In this state, growth halts and stagnation sets in. Arrogance is not just an individual trait. It can infect cultures, institutions, and communities. It shows up in decisions made without consultation, in leadership that does not listen, and in relationships where domination replaces dialogue. Wherever arrogance is tolerated, authenticity disappears. People begin to withhold themselves, to shrink, to perform. The space becomes less alive, less creative, less safe. At its core, arrogance is a resistance to the present moment, where all are equal in being. It resists the humility required to accept that one is not the center of the universe. It refuses to acknowledge the vast intelligence of others, of life itself. To not tolerate arrogance is to honor the wisdom of stillness over noise, depth over surface, presence over pretense. It is to create a space where each person is invited to be fully human, without masks, without comparisons. Manipulation is a quiet theft, often unnoticed until the damage is done. It does not arrive with brute force or loud commands, but with subtlety and strategy cloaked in charm, guilt, persuasion, or confusion. It seeks to control rather than to connect, to extract rather than to understand. Manipulation distorts reality, bending it to fit one's agenda while denying others their clarity, their agency, their right to choose freely. It is a violation not of the body, but of the will, the inner compass that guides thought, feeling, and decision. When someone manipulates, they treat others not as ends in themselves, but as means to fulfill personal desire, fear, or ambition. There is a hidden narrative, always just beneath the surface: you exist for me. Whether it's through flattery designed to disarm, withholding affection to punish, or twisting facts to control outcomes, manipulation always operates from a place of disconnection from others and from the present moment. It is a way of relating that avoids truth, vulnerability, and openness. It does not trust life to unfold honestly. It insists on forcing an outcome through calculated influence. To allow manipulation is to silently accept that our own needs, boundaries, and perceptions are secondary. Over time, this tolerance creates inner dissonance. We begin to question our judgments, doubt our instincts, and lose trust in our own voice. Manipulation gradually erodes the self. It conditions a person to feel small, guilty, or dependent. The manipulator gains power not by direct command, but by creating an emotional climate in which others feel obligated, confused, or indebted. And in that climate, the authentic self begins to disappear. The presence of manipulation signals a deep imbalance in a relationship. It signals that truth is not welcome, that emotions are being used as weapons rather than shared as experiences. The one who manipulates often justifies their actions by convincing themselves they are helping, protecting, or guiding. But help that denies another person's freedom is not help, it is control. And love that requires deception to survive is not love, it is fear in disguise. Manipulation is not sustainable. What is taken through influence must be constantly maintained through more influence. There is no peace in that cycle, only effort and tension. It is a way of being that resists presence and flow. To not tolerate manipulation is to honor one's inner space as sacred, to protect clarity, freedom, and mutual respect. In that protection, there is not aggression but wisdom, a wisdom that sees through the mask, that recognizes the game, and chooses to disengage from it completely. Cruelty is the deliberate infliction of pain, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. It is not simply an act of harm, but a disruption of the natural empathy that flows between living beings. Where empathy connects, cruelty severs. Where compassion softens, cruelty hardens. It arises when a person becomes numb to the inner world of another, when the suffering of someone else becomes irrelevant, amusing, or even satisfying. In cruelty, the heart closes completely. The presence of another is no longer seen as sacred, but as something to be dominated, diminished, or destroyed. Cruelty often begins in subtle ways. It may be masked as discipline, disguised as justice, or wrapped in sarcasm and mockery. But underneath all of its forms lies the same energy, the desire to cause discomfort, to break spirit, to assert power by making another feel small. When cruelty is tolerated even in its mildest forms, it conditions the environment to accept unkindness as normal. Jokes that humiliate, gestures that exclude, words that wound. When accepted without question, these acts invite a colder, harsher atmosphere where fear begins to take root and silence becomes self-protection. To permit cruelty is to allow the spirit of violence to enter, not always through action, but often through indifference. The pain of another becomes background noise. It is no longer responded to, acknowledged, or eased. In such a state, people learn to numb themselves, not just to others' suffering, but to their own. The body becomes tense. The breath becomes shallow. A quiet fear grows: if cruelty is permitted here, then I too am vulnerable to it. And so people begin to retreat, to hide, to shrink away from openness. Cruelty thrives where presence is absent. It needs a disconnection between action and awareness, between feeling and consequence. The person who is cruel must first separate from their own sensitivity, from their own capacity to feel the pain they are causing. In doing so, they also sever their connection to stillness, to depth, to being. Cruelty in this way is not only a wound inflicted outward, it is also a reflection of inner fragmentation, of a self that has grown cold and isolated within. To witness cruelty and say nothing is to become part of its continuation. To excuse it is to normalize it, and to stay silent in its presence is to betray the deeper knowing within, the knowing that recognizes the suffering of another as real, meaningful, and undeserved. The refusal to tolerate cruelty is not born of anger, but of alignment with compassion, with truth, with the quiet dignity that belongs to all living things. Hypocrisy is the quiet contradiction between word and action, belief and behavior. It is the dissonance that arises when one presents an image to the world that is not supported by their inner reality. Often, it is not loud or flamboyant. It wears a calm mask, one that mimics virtue, speaks of values, promotes ideals. But beneath the surface, there is something unresolved, something misaligned. The energy of hypocrisy is not just in what is done, but in what is concealed. It is a hiding from truth, a denial of authenticity, and a performance meant to maintain an illusion. When hypocrisy is present, trust becomes fragile. Words lose their weight not because they are wrong, but because they are hollow. When someone claims to value honesty, but speaks behind closed doors with deceit, when someone preaches kindness, but operates with judgment, when someone appears generous in public, but manipulates in private, there is a quiet fracture in the space between them and others. That fracture is not always immediately visible. It may be felt first as a vague discomfort, a subtle mistrust, a sense that something does not quite add up. To tolerate hypocrisy is to invite confusion. It is to live in an environment where truth is flexible, where actions do not follow principles, and where people learn to say what sounds right instead of living what feels true. Over time, this erodes clarity not just in how we view others, but in how we understand ourselves. We begin to question our instincts, to doubt our perceptions, to become cautious with our own openness. The air becomes heavy with pretense, and in that heaviness, real connection struggles to breathe. Hypocrisy thrives in the absence of presence. It is sustained by roles, by performance, by the need to be seen in a certain way. But true presence has no interest in appearance. It seeks only alignment between the inner and the outer, the spoken and the lived. Hypocrisy resists this alignment because it fears vulnerability. It fears what might happen if the mask slips, if the truth is revealed, if imperfection is acknowledged. And yet imperfection is not the problem, it is human, it is natural. What creates harm is not the flaw, but the pretense of flawlessness. It is not the struggle, but the denial of struggle. When we witness hypocrisy and accept it, we reinforce a culture of performance over truth. We teach ourselves and others that how things look matters more than how they truly are. This acceptance breeds cynicism, mistrust, and disconnection. In such an atmosphere, silence becomes self-defense, and the inner world is guarded, not shared. These 7 behaviors, if allowed to persist in our lives, create a dissonance that reverberates far beyond the immediate moment. Yet the power to change this lies in presence, in conscious awareness, and in the clarity of the boundaries we set. When we refuse to tolerate these disturbances, we do not act out of anger or control, but out of a quiet strength, born from the stillness within. We protect the sanctity of peace, the garden of trust, and the temple of integrity. The path forward is simple yet profound: to be vigilant in what we permit, to honor the energy we invite, and to hold space for truth and compassion to flourish. In this mindful refusal to tolerate what diminishes us, we reclaim our power not by force but by conscious choice, and through this choice we awaken to a life of greater harmony and freedom. Disloyalty is the quiet unraveling of trust, often unnoticed until the foundation has already crumbled. It is not always dramatic or explosive. Sometimes it appears in whispers, in absence, in the subtle act of turning away when one is most needed. Loyalty is not merely the act of standing by someone in ease or pleasure. It is the deep commitment to presence, to truth, to honoring a bond even when it is tested. Disloyalty breaks that commitment. It is the refusal to remain grounded in connection, to show up when it matters, to protect what is sacred between individuals. At its core, disloyalty reveals a lack of rootedness. A person who is disloyal has not fully anchored themselves in integrity. They shift with the winds of convenience, aligning not with principle but with momentary benefit. In this way, disloyalty is a form of abandonment, not always physical, but emotional, relational, spiritual. It is the silent decision to prioritize self-image, self-interest, or self-protection over shared truth and mutual respect. And when this pattern is tolerated, it normalizes an environment where commitment is conditional, where people become replaceable, and where bonds are fragile and easily severed. To allow disloyalty into one's life is to accept a certain instability in relationship. The mind becomes uncertain, the heart becomes guarded, and the body senses the tension of betrayal not yet spoken. There is an intuitive knowing that something essential is being withheld, a presence, a defense, a standing with that should be there but isn't. This absence is not always voiced, but it is deeply felt, and over time, it teaches us to withdraw, to question whether others will truly remain when the moment becomes difficult or the path unclear. Disloyalty cannot survive in the presence of deep awareness. It hides in the shadows of denial, in the hope that no one will notice the silence, the distance, the lack of support. But awareness sees what is real, even when it is unspoken. It sees where the heart has been left unguarded, where words have been broken, where trust has been silently traded for approval or gain. To not tolerate disloyalty is to recognize the sacredness of consistency, of standing firm in relationship, not out of obligation, but out of alignment with truth. True loyalty does not require perfection. It does not ask for constant agreement or blind allegiance. It asks for presence, for the willingness to remain real, even in the discomfort, for the courage to walk with someone through silence, through conflict, through uncertainty. To refuse disloyalty is not to demand flawless behavior, but to uphold a standard of devotion rooted in authenticity. It is to protect the space where mutual trust can breathe, where hearts are safe to unfold without fear of sudden departure or quiet